Today, we're going to be interviewing David Burke, barrister and author of a number of books, including the one we're going to be talking about today, The Puppet Masters: How MI6 Masterminded Ireland's Deepest State Crisis. In this book, David Burke uncovers the clandestine activities of Patrick Crinnion, a Garda intelligence officer who secretly served as a mole for MI6 during the early years of the Troubles. As the Garda Síochána launched a manhunt for the chief of staff of the IRA, Crinnion found himself playing a crucial role in the effort to track him down. This book also details the shady dealings of MI6, from attempts to smear Irish politicians to plans for using criminals as assassins, and much more. David, thank you for taking time to chat to me today.
Oh, not at all, Arthur. My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
David, first of all, before we get into the nitty gritty of the book, what it's all about, it's quite exciting. Tell us the arms crisis. What was the arms crisis? The history of the arms crisis, I should say, the anniversary of the same. How's your book linked into all this? Just give us a brief overview of that.
Well, the arms crisis seems to confuse an awful lot of people. And what I say is it's very, very, very simple. The only thing that makes the arms crisis difficult to understand is all the lies that have been told about it and around it. It's terribly simple. What happened was the nationalists, particularly in Belfast and Derry, came under siege from some extreme loyalists, B specials who were out of control. We all know what happened. Hundreds of families were burnt out of their houses, for example, in Belfast in Bombay Street. They were absolutely terrified. Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister of Britain, and his cabinet sent the British Army in to calm things down. They came in, they did a great job. There was later on what became known as the honeymoon period. But the nationalists were absolutely terrified that this could kick off again. And you can imagine a number of scenarios where it could. The British Army could pull, or there mightn't be enough British soldiers on the ground to deal with more widespread violence. During the really bad violence of August of 1969, Jack Lynch and the government sent the Irish Army to the border, ostensibly to set up field hospitals for all the refugees fleeing across the border. But there were plenty of soldiers still alive who'll tell you, no, 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 we were getting ready to invade if necessary. If the nationalist people in Derry, for example, were being slaughtered, we were going to cross the border. There are even stories about how contacts had been made with the British Army, that if the Irish Army and the British Army came face to face, that they agreed they wouldn't shoot at each other. So there was an awful lot of pressure on the Fianna Fáil government of the day to deal with this problem. And the one thing Fianna Fáil didn't want to do, no sane government would want to do, would be to send the army across the border. So they reached this type of a compromise whereby they agreed to help the nationalists who had coalesced under what were called citizens' defence committees. They agreed to not supply them with guns, but to bring guns in to the Republic. And the original plan was to store them in a monastery in County Cavan. Now, that fell apart for reasons we don't really have to go into, but it's motivation which is important here. The intention, the plan, and the motive was to store them, whether in the monastery in County Cavan or elsewhere. And in the event that the troubles erupted, those guns would be there and they could be distributed to the nationalists, the Citizens Defence Committees, not the IRA. And if you look at the personalities who were in charge of the Citizens Defence Committees, a lot of them ended up in the SDLP. The man in charge of the coordinating committee was a guy called Tom Connaughty. Tom Connaughty was the furthest thing you could imagine from an IRA man. He actually ended up as an advisor on a committee to William Whitelaw. William Whitelaw was the first Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. He ended up under Thatcher being the Deputy Prime Minister. He was a Tory. So these were the type of people that were there.
So, David, Patrick Crinnion was quite an interesting character by the sounds of it, his escapades with
Mm.
MI6 and so on, very much the focus of the book. But what drew you to Patrick Crinnion as a man, as a character, as we could well call a spy for MI6 and everything else? Was it a particular focus point in history? Was it a particular event? What drew you to him?
Well, I always thought it was absolutely intriguing that a Garda intelligence officer had been arrested, found with an MI6 officer in Dublin, and the pair of them had spent a little bit of time in prison, and yet there's very, very, very little written about it. He gets a footnote here and there, often when people are discussing the more famous case of the Little Johns. Now, History Ireland did something A very good article there 5 or 6 years ago. But really, other than that, he'd been completely ignored. And I was reading a rather excellent book by a fellow called Tony Craig, and Crinnion appeared in a footnote. But it was a footnote relating to some correspondence, and turns out that Crinnion had been writing letters to people left, right, and centre. And as he would write to one person, he sometimes included the enclosed the letter he'd written to somebody else. And he wrote letters to the Archbishop, one Archbishop Conway, Bishop Conway, in Armagh, and all of the correspondence was contained in the library up in Armagh. So I hot-footed it up to Armagh, and after a lot of trouble, we found the entire correspondence, and my jaw dropped when I read some of what was in it. That was the first. That was how I got hooked on this, and I knew there was a big story to tell then at that time.
Okay. You've spoken already about the arms crisis, what that entailed, but tell us, including the books you've already written, you've written quite a bit about the Ireland's troubled history in that regard. But
Hmm.
what new did you learn when researching for this particular book, for the book,
Well, I was
The Life of Patrick Crinnion?
at the time I got Crinnion's correspondence. I was very advanced in the book on the arms crisis, and I discovered something that made my jaw drop. And it was that Crinnion was responsible for exploding the arms crisis. Now, what I didn't know at that time, and I couldn't tell from the correspondence, all 40 or 50 pages of it, was when he had begun to work for MI6. And the myth that I now know is a myth, the disinformation that had been put out was that he'd only worked for them for a few months, 6 months maybe, in 1972, which meant then that if he was the person who, and I'll explain what I mean by this in a minute, who kick-started the arms crisis, he wasn't working for MI6. But what I found out later on was that he'd been working for MI6 since about 1960. So that meant that when he kick-started the arms crisis, he was working for MI6, and that was rather jaw-dropping. How I discovered that he had been working for MI6 long before that was I got a second tranche of documents, most of which he had written himself while in prison in Mountjoy, a lot of which was communicated to his lawyers and his legal teams, and miraculously, an awful lot of it had survived his own actual handwritten notes. I have the actual originals, his handwriting, and that made it quite clear that he had been working for them for a hell of a long time. Now, I've said a moment ago he kick-started the arms crisis. What I mean by that is the infamous attempt to import the guns in April of 1970 had failed. The police had become involved in it. No guns ever arrived. They were going to fly in on a flight from Vienna, and the flight was cancelled. And the whole thing was covered up. And Jack Lynch had told his cabinet that, this had gone on, this had happened, and there were going to be no more attempts. And as far as he was concerned, the issue was over and finished. And it would have been over and finished and might have been forgotten about. And God knows when it would have emerged into the public domain, if ever. But in early May, very early May 1970, in the middle of the night, a man crept up the laneway towards the bungalow where Liam Cosgrave lived with a note signed Garda, and had details of it, not fully accurate, but had enough details to put Liam Cosgrave on notice of what had happened. And Cosgrave was then able to talk to other people, including some very senior guards, and they confirmed that yes, this had happened. And then the arms crisis exploded, and there was an enormous fallout that reverberated for decades, in fact, as a result of that.
Okay. Tell us, you mentioned about these letters, and in the book you speak about the letters and the memorandum of Patrick Crinnion that you got hold of. Tell us, how did you actually manage to get hold of all this material? And indeed, how did it shape your view of him as a double agent? And were there any real surprises in any of this?
Yes, they say when you're a biographer that you come and tend to like your subject. And I was warming towards Crinnion quite a bit, having read his correspondence. But there was a little nag at the back of my head, David, this is just his version of events. There could be others, and this is him speaking uninterrupted and him making his case. But nonetheless, I could see some of the interesting points he was making. Then I got all the other information that he was writing to his lawyers, explaining what he had done, and I could see that there was a huge inconsistency between what he was saying in the letters that he was sending to people like Garrett Fitzgerald and Conor Cruise O'Brien and guards, and he was sending them to the head of the United Nations and various religious dignitaries. And it was quite clear that he was telling quite a few lies. So that made me very, very, very skeptical about him again. And but I got a much more balanced view of him, thankfully, as a result of that. So that was the type of information I had.
Okay, so there are two key names mentioned in the book. There's Cathal Goulding and there
Mm.
is Sean McInstefan. If two key members in the IRA, there was a bit of a power struggle, an internal power struggle happening there between these two men. Give us an idea. How did this conflict, how did this power struggle impact on the whole broader political landscape in Ireland in terms of what was happening?
Mm. Well, Goulding and McStefan were colleagues. They were friends. They had both been arrested in England when they had raided the Armstead armory, and they spent nearly 7 years in prison. And I think when Goulding was in prison, he had a complete change of mind about physical force violence. He saw a different way forward, and he was meant to have other IRA people like Joe Cahill have said that he converted to communism because he was playing chess with Klaus Fuchs. Now, Klaus Fuchs, maybe a year ago, nobody knew who he was, but he features in the Oppenheimer movie. He was the atomic spy, and he was in prison with in Britain at the time that Goulding was in prison. So you have him becoming a communist, whilst on the other hand, you had Sean McStefan, who was actually an Englishman, born in England, didn't set foot in Ireland until he was quite well into his adulthood, but had become involved with the IRA in London. And he wasn't a communist; he was traditional physical force. So you had these two forces. Both of these guys were released from prison. Both of them came back to Ireland. Both of them rapidly climbed the ladder. As you can imagine, having spent 7 years in prison, they would have been treated very well. They would have been highly respected within the Republican movement. Goulding became chief of staff of the IRA after the border campaign had ended. That border campaign was in 1956 to 62. It was crushed by the then Minister for Justice. Well, he put out the flickering embers that were left over. Then Minister for Justice Charlie Haughey. So you then had this idea within the Republican movement, which is Sinn Féin and the IRA and various other bodies, Cumann na mBan and others, that we're going to go political. And that's where Goulding went. And that's eventually where Goulding went, because his faction, with him leading it still in the 1970s and 80s, they became Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party. They became the Workers' Party, and then some of them went into Democratic Left. Some of them then went into the Labour Party. So they very much went on the political route. Whereas Mike Stefan, no, physical force, violence. The only way we're ever going to get a united Ireland is to shoot the Brits out. Goulding's idea was, well, the working classes of Northern Ireland are just as oppressed as the working classes anywhere else, and we should make common cause with them. Some people would consider that. I'd certainly consider a really interesting, very interesting approach to it. Other people would say it's a bit pie in the skyish, bit naive. You know, you're really going to make friends with people working in East Belfast, in Harland and Wolff. But anyway, it all fell apart. Anyway, it all fell apart when the Troubles started. But these were the tensions within the IRA, and they had a secret meeting in Knockvicar in December of 1969, and this came to a head. And there were votes taken which really put the Republican movement on the socialist political route, and McStefan and the others went off and they set up the Provisional IRA.
Okay. So your previous works, we've already mentioned about the arms crisis, your previous books, your previous works have covered this in detail. But of course, MI6 would have been embedded to one extent or another into the whole situation of the arms crisis, what was happening in Northern Ireland, and indeed south of the border. So what is your work, The Puppet Masters, what has it revealed about the involvement of MI6 in Irish politics, in Irish policing, and so forth?
The first book I did on the arms crisis was just, this is what happened. And I've explained all of that. It's about the citizens' defence committees and the fear and the guns were going to be put on the border. I then did another book on Kitson, which has nothing to do with any of this. Then I did a third one called An Enemy of the Crown, which was how Haughey had been smeared by the British Secret Service, portraying him as this IRA godfather. And then I've returned, and I'm finished now with it. Third and final book on the arms crisis is the role played by the British Secret Service in the background. And it was very, very, very significant and very, very large. MI6 was run at the time by a guy called Morris Oldfield. Now, he's become more famous perhaps than any other head of MI6 because the John le Carre series of books, which were televised by the BBC, and Alec Guinness played George Smiley. But he went out, he had lunch, he had dinner with Morris Oldfield, and he adopted all of his looks and mannerisms and used those to portray George Smiley in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and all of those. So this guy was in charge, and unfortunately for everybody on both sides of the Irish Sea, Oldfield, despite his much vaunted image, was, I believe, I suggest, I argue, useless. He hadn't a clue what was going on, and he made so many mistakes that all he actually did at the end of the day was help create the provisional IRA. Now, the chain of command to Crinnion was Oldfield, who was very hands-on, and at the time I'm talking about, he hadn't yet become head of MI6. He was deputy chief, and he was responsible for Irish affairs. And his agent in the field was this guy, John Wyman, who ends up in prison with Crinnion, and John Wyman was handling Crinnion. And the split I've spoken about that took place in Knockvicar Mansion in Knockvicar had absolutely nothing to do with Fianna Fáil. The meeting was set up by Cathal Goulding. It was controlled by Cathal Goulding. People like Seamus Costello, who later set up the INLA, was meant to be picking up people like Des Long, who was in the IRA in Munster, and lo and behold, the lift never arrived. So there's a lot of gerrymandering and that. So all the votes went Goulding's way. And while all of this is going on, Crinnion was being fed information by John Wyman, which Crinnion was feeding into Garda intelligence, saying, no. This is all being controlled by Fianna Fáil, which it wasn't. This is all being manipulated, and Fianna Fáil are trying to split the IRA and set up the provisions. It's all absolute nonsense. Now, the most enjoyable part of the book for me, from a research point of view, is I went down to Knockvicar in County Roscommon, and I had a friend down there, and we went around the place and we found this mansion. There were 2 or 3 places that could have fit the description that Crinnion describes in his letters and his correspondence. We found the place, and once I'd found the place, I was then able to find out who had owned it in 1969 from Registry of Deeds and this type of thing. And to my absolute astonishment, I actually knew that he's now passed away, but I knew the guy who owned the property. His name was Jerry Callanan. Most people like me knew him as Jerry Furlong because he was the news agent in Donnybrook, and he was one of the best news agents you could imagine. People would come from all over Dublin on a Wednesday night, politicians especially, to get the early edition of the Phoenix. He always had Phoenix and Private Eye out a day before. And he was, at that point in time, he was a very, I don't mean this in any disrespectful way, but a very, very low-level member of Fianna Fáil. He wasn't a high flyer at all. So I then tracked down a member of his family who told me, yes, that's right. My dad did let Goulding have the mansion for 2 or 3 weeks. And I then began to look a little bit more into Jerry Callanan's background. It turns out he was a great friend of Sean MacBride. And Sean MacBride had gone down the exact same route that Cathal Goulding was trying to take the IRA. Sean MacBride, who went on to set up Amnesty International, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Lenin Peace Prize as well. He had set up Clonmacnoise, and he had gone into coalition in the 50s with 40s with Fine Gael under John A. Costello. And my theory, and Jerry Callanan, the news agent, the owner of Knockvicar Mansion, he'd stood for Clonmacnoise unsuccessfully in one of the elections. He'd remained very, very friendly with Sean MacBride. So I think it's plain what happened. Goulding would have been in touch all the time with someone like MacBride, and he said, "Look, we're trying to have this IRA Army convention," and there would have been discussions about the political route that they were trying to take. And lo and behold, MacBride would have turned around to Callanan and said, "Look, any chance you could lend the house down there?" Now, the house down there, it's worth driving by. It's ideal for an IRA meeting. It's a village, it's out of the way. There's a very long laneway up to it. You can't see the house. On the other side, there's a river sweeping around it. So if you're a special branch man or something like that, trying to get in there to monitor what's going on, it's going to be very, 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 very difficult. Okay. And in the middle of all of this, the guards came to Jerry Callanan's house and told him, "Look, you know what's going down there, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." And he said, "Look, we're watching it, and we don't want you to go down and interfere in any way." So the guards didn't suspect that this gentleman had done anything other than lend his house to these people for the weekend. He wasn't involved. Now, Crinnion found out that this guy was in Fianna Fáil, and he turned that one small, tiny fact into this is a Fianna Fáil plot. And then they add in with no evidence really that Blaney and Haughey and all the others were pulling the strings. And the most ridiculous part of his correspondence and his idea was that if if this hadn't happened, the IRA would never have split. That's a nonsense. The IRA was inevitably going to split. Nothing to do with Fianna Fáil, and has been coming for years and years and years, and it was because of socialism versus physical force.
Okay, I want to ask you about Patrick Crinnion's role with the Garda Intelligence. He was said to be a key figure of that. And of course, eventually he became a mole with MI6. But before you speak to me about how he started with the Garda, then moved to MI6 and a double agent and so forth, just break it down in a few seconds. The clear triangular picture: Patrick Crinnion on Garda Síochána, MI6 back to Patrick Crinnion. What was the key role? Why did the Garda Intelligence first draw him in? Then why did MI6 approach him, and why did it go back in a triangular pattern? Just speak to us about that triangular pattern to paint the picture of how it all played out to begin with.
Well, since the book has come out, I've received more information, and it indicates that Crinnion was just really a puppet, a very small part of a much wider ring involving very senior people in the Irish government. Um, and if you like, I can go into that now. Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. Well, in fact, what happened was Crinnion's father died when he was 7. His mother worked as a housemaid in Powers Court in that magnificent house, and she was such a valued employee that the family let her occupy one of the cottages on the Boghall Road. But when Crinnion was early teenager, I don't know the exact age, he went working for the Earl of Granard in Longford. And obviously the Viscount of Powers Court, Earl of Longford, they would have all known each other. So he was given a job down there. Now Crinnion was an extraordinarily intelligent man. He was later on a member of Mensa, and I think the other staff realized that this guy should be a doctor or a school teacher or something like that. He shouldn't be labourer on an estate. So this was all brought to the attention of the Earl of Granard. Very interesting guy, a genuine hero, World War II hero. He flew behind enemy lines. Places like Romania, took diplomats out ahead of armies invading countries, took them to Greece, and would have been involved with all of the kind of behind the lines British intelligence activities, SOE, MI9, all of those organizations which no longer exist. And he arranged for Crinnion to go to England for 6 weeks. And in England, he was obviously being groomed now by MI6. And they arranged for him to come back. And he then joined the Garda Reserve Force, TACA, T-A-C-A, Síochána, no longer exists. He stayed with them for a while. And then he went into the Guards proper. Now, he was told to expect a tap on the shoulder at some stage. And when the tap came, it was a rather dramatic one. He was in the Guards. He was very successful. He got into the special branch very quickly. And he was then called into government buildings. And he was taken to the top floor where the Department of Justice had an office there. And there he met Thomas Coyne, who was the secretary of the Department of Justice, the top man, the boss. And he told him, "You're now going to be moved to C3. And you have to keep your head low, you have to work hard, and certain things will be asked of you, and you're to respond favorably." Now, C3 was the most important Garda intelligence department. There were, at that time, I think 18 separate special branches around the country. They all reported to C3. C3 analysed all the reports and put together monthly confidential reports for the government, sent into the Department of Justice. And Crinnion is now in there, and he has access to all of these files, because with one or two exceptions, once you got through the locked doors of C3 up in Garda headquarters in Phoenix Park, they had wooden ways of what they call the registry of files, but basically it was just open wooden stack things, and he just put the files in. So he could look at them all. I spoke to one fellow who later became a deputy Garda commissioner who said I was very suspicious of him. I had to go there once or twice, and he offered to file away my papers, and I was suspicious that he was just looking at them. So that's the type of thing that Crinnion was doing in C3. But even more significantly, there was already an MI6 spy in C3. His name was Thomas Mullen. This was all covered up. And Thomas Mullen was spoken to at a later stage after Crinnion was found. He admitted what he had done, and his excuse was, well, someone has to pass the information on to Britain about the IRA. So he was about to leave. He was about to reach retirement. So you can see how the system is working. You have the former head of the Department of Justice grooming Crinnion, putting him into the guards, and then they wait. And in 1960, very early in 1960, Mullen is about to retire. Crinnion is now moved in. Undoubtedly, Mullen showed him the ropes, and Crinnion then starts his spying around about 1960. So that's how the system worked.
But how is it possible that he stayed undetected for so long?
Well, the reason it all fell apart for him was because when the trouble started, John Wyman, his handler, wasn't just handling Crinnion alone. If he'd have just stuck with Crinnion alone, if it was a one-on-one operation, he probably would have gotten away with it. He undoubtedly would have risen very high in the ranks. I believe myself he probably would have come head of C3, at least an assistant Garda commissioner, if not higher. But was running a whole rake of other agents. One of them was a fellow called Alex Forsey, obviously a pseudonym, not his real name. And Alex Forsey was found by the special branch sniffing around a Sinn Féin office in late 1972. They thought he was an IRA man. They arrested him. He says, look, I'm only doing the same job as you. And they didn't believe him. And he let it drop somehow or another that he was going to be meeting his handler, who was John Wyman. So Wyman flew into Dublin Airport, went out to the hotel where he was meant to be meeting Forsey, and there the guards arrested him, found out where he was staying. He was staying in the Burlington Hotel. And then they watched the Burlington Hotel, and who turns up to meet Crinnion? Sorry, who turns up to meet Wyman, but Crinnion. So they now had captured the whole ring. Well, not the whole ring, obviously, but they captured a significant part of it. So that's how it fell apart.
Okay. So at one point, your book reveals that Crinnion was going to write to Jack Lynch, of all people. He was going to reveal details about his handler. Like you have various expressions, like you've got mole, double agent, maybe even triple agent. I mean, what was he? Was he betraying the betrayed? Or what was the story about writing to Jack Lynch to reveal all? What was that about?
It's a great question, and I have to say, Arthur, I'm still trying to figure it out in my own mind because one has to speculate. But this is the third tranche of documentation I got was a 19-page letter, handwritten. I have the original, and it was written by a guy in the Department of Justice, sent to a very, very, very senior figure in the Irish government, not a politician, not an elected politician, who has given it to me, and it reveals an even deeper level. Now, I've described an awful lot of it already, all of that stuff about the Earl of Granard and Thomas Coyne in the Department of Justice. Now, for clarity, Coyne was head of the Department of Justice 1949 to 1960. 1960 to 1970 was Peter Berry, and then Andy Ward came after him, and he was there till 86. So when this information emerged, Coyne was no longer in charge of the Department of Justice, nor indeed was his protege, right-hand man, Peter Berry. What did this story tell? Well, basically, the Department of the two spies, Wyman and Crinnion, were in Mountjoy prison, and there was a search of their rooms one day, and they found a letter hidden inside a tray, pressed in between a tray, that Crinnion was writing and hoping to smuggle out, and it was addressed to Jack Lynch. And he was telling Jack Lynch, essentially, put simply, look, all I've done is follow the orders of the Department of Justice. Why am I here? Get me out of here, please. And he tells the story I've told. This caused, as you can imagine, a consternation. But one individual in the Department of Justice was determined now that this wasn't going to be covered up. So he made sure that the letter was given to a military dispatch officer and sent up to the Taoiseach, and that a copy of it was put into the Department of Justice. Now, I spoke to the guy who ran Garda Intelligence. Joe Ainsworth was his name. he retired from the Guards as a deputy commissioner. He was an assistant commissioner, very high rank. He was in charge of Garda intelligence 1979 to 1983. And one of the tasks he was set by his commissioner, Commissioner McLaughlin, was to quote unquote to find out what had been going on in C3, because McLaughlin obviously suspected that it was deeply and heavily penetrated by British intelligence. And one of the first things Joe Ainsworth did when he went into the department was say, "Can I see the file on Crinnion?" And guess what? There was no file on Crinnion. Can you imagine that? No file on Crinnion, nothing. So clearly, this letter to Jack Lynch should have been copied to C3, should have been on file there, wasn't there. I don't have sources inside the modern day Department of Justice who could have a peep for me in the archives. But I'd say I wouldn't even bother asking them, because there's absolutely no chance in hell that that letter has disappeared. The only real question in my mind is, did that letter ever reach Jack Lynch? There's a reason to think it didn't, and there's a reason to think it did. The reason to think it didn't is because his biographer, Dermot Keogh, published a book, and he had access to Jack Lynch's papers, and he dug up some really interesting stuff, including the Forsey. I think, I'm pretty sure Dermot Keogh was the first person to tell the public about the Forsey, Alex Forsey. This was the other spy, but there's nothing there in the book about Crinnion, and I have absolutely no doubt that if there was, there would have been a few pages, if not an entire chapter on it. So it doesn't look like the document ever reached Jack Lynch. Now, that's the reason to say it didn't. The reason to perhaps think it did was Lynch gave this really unusual interview in August of 1973 to ITV after the trial of the Littlejohn brothers, more MI6 agents who robbed banks and things like that. And he said that there are good reasons to suspect that there was a lot of British intelligence dirty trickery going on. Now, those aren't his exact words. You can go onto YouTube and it has the interview. It's there. And I quoted it in the book as well, anyway. And that would indicate that Lynch was really, really, really annoyed about the interference by British intelligence. And if he knew that Crinnion had, for example, exploded the arms crisis, well, you can well imagine how he would be very, very annoyed. So I simply don't know if that ever got to Jack Lynch. My gut instinct is it didn't. My gut instinct is somebody someone in the Department of Justice stopped the letter reaching him. I just don't think Jack Lynch would have just sat in it and done nothing forever.
Okay. Your book covers lots of different aspects as well, everything from MI6 seemingly using villains and criminals as assassins to the murder of a Garda, possibly the cover-up of the murder of a Garda, lots more. We'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, Patrick Crinnion himself, just give me an idea. You mentioned the word earlier on there, disappeared. Patrick Crinnion, from my understanding from what your book says, he disappeared for a while. He ended up, as you said, in prison. Just detailing from the moment he was uncovered from the Gardaí surveilling the Burlington Hotel to his cover being blown, to what actually happened to him in prison at the end of his life. Just sum it up for us. What actually happened to him?
He went to prison, he was arrested, he was taken to Mountjoy. He had a gun on him. They didn't realize this, and there was all farces and him trying to take out the gun and all the rest of it. He convinced them he was a guard, and he then was waiting for his colleagues to come. I've no doubt that his colleagues knew exactly what had been going on, that they knew that Wyman was there. And nobody came. He was left on his own, and then he was put on trial. He was found guilty of the lesser charge. The more serious charges weren't proceeded with because they would have had to produce files and documents, which they didn't want to do so, even in camera, even before a distinguished High Court judge. So he got out with a slap on the wrist, time served in February of 1973, and he took a lift with Wyman's barrister, Frank Martin, who later became a circuit court judge, and he was so afraid that the IRA were going to be outside Mountjoy prison when he came out that he jumped into the car. He got out at a place called Whitehall, which is on the road out of Dublin City towards the airport, and he went back into town. He was a vain man. He got his hair cut and all the rest of it. He arranged to meet his family, whizzed back out then to Dublin airport, where MI6 had sent over a Foreign Office jet. He was whooshed through customs onto the jet, flown over to Birmingham, and then he became, for about a year or two, he became Ireland's Lord Lucan. Everybody wanted to know where he was, what had happened to him. And after about a year, I think the public kind of lost interest, but the guards never did. And he certainly remained a Lord Lucan figure with the guards. And there were all types of reports he's seen here, he's seen there. And on the surface, all of these reports seem completely contradictory. He can't be in Australia and in Africa and in America. But guess what? He was. Now, I've spoken to some people who said, well, look, the people who saw him in Africa and Kenya, places, they knew him. It was him. When he saw them, he turned and he ran out of the hotel, bar, whatever it was. What had in fact happened was he'd gone to England. He'd been given a few jobs, but then MI6 obviously helped him get a really nice, lucrative job selling airplane parts. Now, remember, he was a very intelligent man. He was an expert in munitions. He really understood bomb making and a lot of stuff like that. So they got him a part with the Scandinavian company, and he went around all over the world. And hence, he was in America, Australia, Africa, and all these people saw him, and he was busy. But it created the myth that he was abroad, somewhere mysterious. No, he was living in Surrey. He probably walked by Irish people every day of the week. He brought up his two children. He was very successful financially. He had many properties in across England, and he lived in Surrey. And his local MP was ex-Eton type. He lived in this lovely red brick house. Did very well. And round about 2000, 2001, he decided he wanted to come back to Ireland, and he came back to Ireland under an assumed name, false passport, obviously provided to him by MI6. And he lived, I can't say where, I know exactly where, but I can't say for the moment anyway. I will later on, maybe, because they're relatives still in that house and they don't cause them any grief. He kept dogs. He was afraid of being recognized, perhaps. He was near a seaport, so if he had to travel to England, he could go by sea. He never, as best he could, he never went through Dublin Airport. He occasionally would have flown in and out Cork. And as far as I can tell, from very reliable sources, the guards had no idea he was back in the country under an assumed name. All they were aware of, occasionally there might be a funeral and they would anticipate that he might come back and they would watch what was going on. But they were watching what was going on so that there wouldn't be any trouble. Nobody would be shot dead. Crinnion wasn't wanted. He'd done his time in prison. He'd done his sentence. He'd paid his debt to society. So they were never going to arrest him. And then he got Parkinson's and he died in June of 2021, and his ashes were spilt out over the Sugarloaf overlooking Bray where he lived as a young
Okay.
man.
You mentioned there earlier on he was tried under the less serious charge because, of course, to bring forth the secret documents, those documents wouldn't have been optimal. But tell us, this was early 1973. This is before Ireland joined the European Union. This is before, I'm guessing, well, maybe not before, but in or around the abolishment of the death sentence for treason. So could this more serious charge have brought the possibility of execution?
No, I don't think so. I don't think any judge would have sentenced them to that. It wasn't the type of treason, maybe killing the president of Ireland or the Taoiseach. It really wasn't in that league. It was treasonous. But what he was being charged with was a breach of the Official Secrets Act, and there wasn't a death penalty for that, as far as I can as far as I can tell. Now you've kind of caught me there a little bit. I'd have to check it, but I'm pretty certain there wasn't a death sentence for that. Very, very serious charges. Now, another reason why Crinnion became unravelled was because Willie Whitelaw, the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, kind of viewed himself as a kind of a M type figure, M in the James Bond movies. And he was living when he was in Northern Ireland in Stormont Castle, and he had given a floor above him to MI6, and he used to drink late into the night, get drunk with the head of MI6 in Northern Ireland at the time, a guy called Rowley. Rowley later on became the deputy chief of MI6, so a very senior officer. And they came up over their whiskies. They came up with this ridiculous idea of taking all the reports they had from Crinnion without disguising them negligently and putting them into a report to shame Jack Lynch. They brought the thing down, they gave it to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and then it eventually found its way onto Jack Lynch's desk. So you can imagine Jack Lynch is reading the document, and the idea is, shame on you, Taoiseach. We know you've got many IRA men on the border. Here's their names. Why aren't you doing anything about it? You've now no excuse. You have their names and addresses, etc. Lynch gets to the third or fourth page and he realizes he has read all of this before. Not only has he read it before, but the syntax, the English, everything is similar. Picks up the phone to the head of the special branch and he says, there's a spy in the camp. Go find him. So at that stage, I think plans might have been put in the movement in the background to protect the more senior members of the spy ring, guys like Thomas Coyne, albeit he was retired. And whether all the rest of it and Crinnion being found in the Burlington Hotel was set up, I doubt it somehow. But when he was found in the Burlington Hotel, he was the perfect scapegoat to get Jack Lynch off everybody else's back. And Crinnion was deserted. He was hung out on the bleachers, went to prison, and then, as I said, disappeared and went to England and
Okay.
lived out the rest of his life.
Tell me, I just want to bring you back. You mentioned earlier on about a couple of figures in the IRA. Sean McIntyre, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly again, I hope I am. And of course, there was Cathal Goulding. The two men had very different political views. Sean had somewhat, you could say, conservative views, whereas Cathal Goulding had more, let's say, communist views. And this, of course, caused a split. MI6, your book details, capitalize on this to one extent or another. It gives an understanding. Did they capitalize? Am I right to say that? And how so?
Well, you divide and conquer. And in the beginning, the great fear was not this irrelevant little splinter group, the Provisional IRA. I mean, the IRA was still there, and when the Troubles began, the Goulding's official IRAs, they became known, they became sucked into it, and they engaged in gun battles. Famously, Joe McCann involved in gun battles in Belfast with the British Army. They blew up Aldershot, which was the headquarters of the paratroopers. Didn't kill any soldiers. They killed domestic staff and others. So they were quite violent, but they were the real target. Like people who would have spoken now to Des O'Malley, who was Minister for Justice at this time, that they were seen as the real danger, not the Provisional IRA. They kind of emerged as the force to be reckoned with a number of years later. Goulding's heart was not in a physical force violence battle. So in 72, the official IRA declared a ceasefire. Now, one of the things that tragically happened with the arms crisis was it destroyed the citizens' defence committees. I described them earlier on: Tom Connaughey, Devlin, Paddy Doherty and Derry, people like that. They were not interested in fighting. They were interested in defence. They didn't want any trouble. They wanted trouble to end. So when they were destroyed by the arms crisis because the light was shone on them, they were portrayed as the IRA and they weren't. They were exposed as people who were going to be taking guns. So that was enough to destroy the citizens' defence committees. They're now gone. The officials by 72 have declared a ceasefire. The only people left are the Provisional IRA. So if Oldfield and MI6 had not interfered, had not created the arms crisis, the citizens' defence committees would have been there. How successful would the Provisional IRA? Well, that's an utter imponderable. But by removing the citizens' defence committees from the equation, I know a lot of them went off and became the SDLP. It didn't quite disappear. But by removing them from the equation, I think a big door was opened for the Provisional IRA and for Max Stefan. And they are very clear physical force violence. There's only one thing that the British understand, and that's a gun pointed at them approach. Succeeded.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier on about Jack Lynch and this whole affair, how it's covered in your book. Jack Lynch fought back, but other figures as well, like Charlie Haughey. Charlie Haughey, of course, had a lot of bad press in later years. There were also, of course, Neil Blaney and so on. There were major figures in the whole arms crisis. MI6 getting in and maneuvering their way in there and causing political division and causing trouble by exploiting all this. How is this all covered in your book?
Well, I did the third book I did is called An Enemy of the Crown. So I have a full book on the smear campaign against Haughey. Oh, they did all sorts of things. And Crinnion, by the way, was involved in one of the maneuvers. I'll tell you about that in a second. But I have a document that I have been given by a guy called Colin Wallace. Colin Wallace was one of the main propaganda operatives in Northern Ireland at the time. And what British intelligence, broadly speaking, there's so many units, I won't go into that, it's just too detailed and tedious, but broadly speaking, they had a propaganda department, and they would get, for example, a booklet by Goulding's people, and they would reproduce it. And what they would do is they tighten up the space between the lines, and by the time you got to page 4 or 5 or 6, now there's enough room to put in another paragraph. So they would put in paragraphs about Haughey and how he was involved in the IRA, and then they would disseminate this. So they're up to all of these type of dirty tricks, forging documents, putting them into circulation, blaming Haughey. And this of course, coming on top of the arms trial was, I mean, they were pushing an open door with an awful lot of people who didn't understand about the Citizens Defence Committees and the difference between them and the IRA. And then there's a Latin phrase called sibilare, which is to whisper. And the tactic of long-standing tactic in Ireland of going back to the Second World War, John Betjeman, the poet, was a British intelligence agent in the embassy, and he used to go around, as did his successors, to the pubs and the hostelries where all the hacks and journalists were working, and he would start spreading all these rumors. So obviously Betcham's long gone by the time the troubles were started, but his successors in the British Embassy were going down and they were spreading rumors about how he was doing this and how he was doing that and how he's meeting with the correspondent from TASS, the Russian Soviet newspaper. And all of these relentless incremental smears were being put out. All types of nonsense was being fed as well to the American embassy. And we know that because WikiLeaks has published some cables that were never meant to see the light of day. And you can see the Americans are sending over horror stories about Haughey and his involvement with the IRA and Blaney and his involvement with the IRA. And by the way, it's complete nonsense. In 1972-73, when this was going on, there were two IRAs in Ireland, officials and the provisionals. But if you're to read the American cables, high up sources in the government, perhaps Crinnion, maybe one of his colleagues, was telling the American embassy that there was a third IRA and it was completely under the control of Neil Blaney, and there were about 100 gunmen in it. And this and there were communist influences. You can imagine all the rest of it. So they had all of these smears going down. They were blackguarding Blaney and Haughey in America by feeding the Dublin embassy here all of this nonsense about a third IRA force. Crinnion was directly involved. Remember, I mentioned that his predecessor in C3, who had spied before he had gone into C3, was a guy called Thomas Mullen. Well, Thomas Mullen and Crinnion were, just before Crinnion was arrested, were going around trying to link Haughey to a factory. And well, I can't say where it is because people are still alive and they weren't involved in gun running, so I don't want to smear them. Saying that this company was an American company, was connected to the mafia, and that they were bringing in machinery, and that amongst the machinery were guns and weapons. Nonsense. The IRA did not need to smuggle in broken down pieces of weaponry in machines from America. They were bringing in tons, well, maybe not tons, but they're bringing in loads and loads of weapons into Dublin port, where they had a network set up with some of the union people down there. They didn't need this, but this is the type of thing that Crinnion and Mullen were trying to do. They were trying to fabricate a link between Haughey, maybe he'd visited this factory, maybe he knew a shareholder, something like that, and then they were going to launch this smear campaign, and that would have gone ahead, but for the fact Crinnion was arrested at the last minute.
Okay. The book also details a cover-up. There was a Garda member of Garda Síochána murdered. The intelligence agency stepped in to cover this up. What was that about?
I actually find this very distressing and disturbing because of the way that the family of Garda Fallon has been maltreated, in my view, by everybody ever since. And they've been exploited too for propaganda purposes, in my view as well. But essentially what happened was there was a crowd called Ser Era, long since disappeared, and they had perpetrated an armed robbery in Blessington and Wicklow. And the suspect in it was identified, and his name was provided to C3 and should have been circulated to all the Garda, particularly the locality where the individual, the suspect, lived, and it wasn't. Had it been, he might have been arrested. Now, he was at the time, and I have to be very, very, very clear about this, at the time he was suspected of another robbery, during which a very, very brave Garda officer who was off duty but remained on duty went to the bank robbery where it was taking place, and it cost him his life because the Ser Era gunman coming out shot him dead. Now, eventually, one of the members of Ser Era was put on trial and he was acquitted. Now, the man's presumed innocent until guilty, and he was found innocent. That's not the point. The point is that when they were looking for this individual long before he was placed on trial, Crinnion discovered that the special branch had not been given his name. He went down and he spoke to the head of special branch, a guy called Fleming, and they discovered this. And what they did was they fabricated a file to indicate that, in fact, C3 had circulated this. Now, the idea was, imagine if the guy had been found guilty. He was found innocent, but imagine if he'd been found guilty. The guards could have arrested him had they done their job properly, and this robbery wouldn't have taken place and Garda Fallon wouldn't have been killed. So that's the cover up there. But there's a more sinister, much more sinister level to this. The gun that was used to kill this very brave soldier, Garda Fallon, who wasn't given a state funeral, he should have been, whose family, I believe, were pretty much abandoned by the state when they should have been well taken care of. The gun that was used to kill him came from a factory in Birmingham. Crinnion knew that this was a supply chain network. I've described in more detail in the book what he knew and how he knew it. But essentially, MI6 let the guns continue to flow from Birmingham to Ireland for good intelligence purposes. They could track them, follow them, see who was getting them, work out the networks. But unfortunately, it was a gun from the Star. It was a Star gun, which had been proved, as they call it, in Birmingham, that killed him. Now, if MI6 had stopped and shut down that network much earlier on, maybe, now the dates are very difficult to pin this down, but maybe those guns wouldn't have gotten through. Now, equally, maybe another gun might have killed Garda Fallon, but it's a fact that MI6 knew about this pipeline. MI6 let it continue for certainly a number of months, and one of the guns from the Star factory killed this unfortunate Garda. You then had a massive MI6 smear campaign, in my view, and I've described the reasons why in the book I think this happened, whereby they tried to say that these guns were brought in by Charlie Haughey's brother. They weren't brought in by Charlie Haughey's brother. And you had politicians in the Dáil raising questions and answering and asking questions about this. And you had yet another smear that in some way the Fallon murder was connected back to Charlie Haughey's brother and therefore Haughey. It's nonsense, it's lies.
Okay.
And Michael McDowell, the Minister for Justice, opened the file, had a very good look at it, and when he was Minister, publicly announced, no, that the guns were not brought in. The guns were brought in by a well-known Dublin criminal. He's still alive, so I won't name him. Michael McDowell called him a lowlife, and that was how the guns got in. Nothing to do with Haughey at all. And there were absurd rumours as well then that Neil Blaney had covered up the murder as well, because he had spirited in his car the killer down to Rosslare Harbour, and he got out on a boat. All lies, all nonsense, but that's how MI6 operate.
Okay, staying with MI6, tell me, when the trouble started, it was a few decades before, of course, that got its independence, and it was even less time before when Ireland left the Commonwealth. So MI6, while a lot of the men and women who would have been perhaps in the secret intelligence prior to independence would have been, that stage, probably long dead, still Britain, the MI6, the intelligence services would have had quite an extensive knowledge of the network that set up in Ireland during the Troubles. So just in terms of the role of MI6 in Ireland, was it purely a role of gathering information, or was it of manipulating structures, manipulating politics, manipulating society? What was the actual role of MI6 in society during the Troubles?
Well, the role of MI6 in the Troubles was to gather intelligence and tell the British government what was going on, and then the government wanted to put pressure on British government wanted to put pressure on Jack Lynch, the Irish government, for example, primarily to introduce very stern, harsh anti-IRA legislation. So towards that end, they managed via the arms crisis to get the likes of Blaney and Haughey out of cabinet. Kevin Boland, who would be more Republican than some of the others who were left behind, resigned in protest, and Podge Brennan, a junior minister, resigned as well. So you had that kind of more tough, hardcore element. Blaney was living on the border. Haughey had family in Derry. He spent his summers up there as well. He had one or two rough encounters with the B specials as a teenager. So you had their perspective out of the way. So that was a great success for them. They had a more compliant group in cabinet. And remember as well, you've mentioned it already, Ireland was trying to get into the European Union, or the EEC as it was called then. So there was a lovely, from their point of view, a lovely opportunity to kind of, if you want to come in with us, you've got to play a bit of ball with us here. So there was perfectly legitimate diplomatic pressure on Jack Lynch to do that. above the table. Now, below the table, you had dirty tricks galore, the arms crisis, you had the Little John brothers. The Little John brothers were two crooks with criminal convictions. Kenneth, the older brother, former paratrooper on the lam, had escaped, or yeah, he had escaped from prison. He was wanted. He was wanted for a robbery in Birmingham, and his job was to go around and create havoc and make Republicans unpopular by robbing banks and that. And he famously engaged in the greatest bank robbery up to that time on Grafton Street, in the bank there at the bottom of Grafton Street. So you had, and then you had the border dossier I've already told you about, when Willie Whitelaw had this document presented to Jack Lynch. So you have above board and below board, you had all this pressure on MI6. Now, MI6 is a department of the Foreign Office. And so this was, so Ireland was recognized, if you like, as a foreign country. If it was, if we'd been still part of the Commonwealth, maybe it might have been an MI5 operation, because they operate where the writ of the Crown kind of operates. But look, Ireland was completely independent of that at this stage. So it was a Foreign Office MI6 operation, if that answers your question.
So there's a huge wealth of information and historical data and points and everything discussed in your book. Tell me, you've published a couple of other books as well. Given the whole sensitivity still to this day around the Troubles, what kind of reaction did you get to your other books? And indeed, what kind of reaction do you reckon you'll get from this book, The Puppet Masters?
Well, the first book came out 6 months after another excellent book on the arms crisis by a guy called Michael Heaney. Excellent book. And a year later, RTE did a documentary called Gunplot, and they relied to quite a large extent on this, on interviews with us and stuff we had done. So that, I do believe, has changed the public perception of what really happened during the arms crisis. That it wasn't a sinister plot by an IRA godfather called Charlie Haughey to set up the provisional IRA. I think that myth has now been disabused. Orty also had a podcast. I think there were 9 episodes of it, and then 2 ancillary ones with tape recordings from the arms trial. So that was that. Second book I did nothing to do with this, about a guy called Brigadier Kitson. The third book then was about the smear campaign against Charlie Haughey. RTE reviewed it at one stage, made it book of the week just before Christmas. I think it was Christmas 2023, maybe 22. I've forgotten at this stage. So whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, if anybody suggested Haughey had been the victim of a smear campaign by the British Secret Service, people would have kind of poo-pooed it and said that's nonsense. But now that, you know, the time has passed, people are more inclined to look at things objectively, especially people who weren't around, people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s. So that was quite successful. This book, well, if it has had any success so far, it has been that the Department of Justice letter that I spoke about exposing Thomas Coyne and the Earl of Granard has come to my attention now. Unfortunately, I didn't have it for the book. It's not in the book. There is an article in the present edition of History Ireland magazine, a 3-page article, where I go into a little bit more detail and quote, but it's essentially what I've told you. But well worth getting. History Ireland, great magazine to support anyway. So public awareness of what was going on in the 1970s, the pressures that were being applied above and below the table by the Foreign Office, is hopefully becoming more and more clear as a result of this book. But am I looking for a tribunal of inquiry, or no? This is history now. Everybody involved is dead. So there's the court of public opinion. So the public is the jury, and they can make their minds up. They can agree or disagree with this.
Okay.
They can read the information I've provided, and they can make their own minds up.
Okay, tell us, over time, more and more internal secret government documents are declassified and made public. There's been recent releases of classified documents detailing MI6's involvement. As time progresses, do you think there'll be more and more details released, perhaps about how MI6 was involved in internal Irish affairs? And what could these possibly detail?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. The way I'll answer it is this. MI6 asked a professor in Queen's called Jeffreys to do an official history. And it only went up to about 1949. And when it came out, I thought this will be, be interesting. There'll be lots of stuff about communists and everything in it, but they're not going to go into any of the dirty tricks. Well, to my astonishment, they actually did give over some really, really interesting files to it. One of which describes how, after the Second World War, there were a lot of Holocaust survivors who'd made their way to the Mediterranean. They were trying to get across to what was then Palestine. And the MI6 guys were going around blowing up boats to prevent this happening because, of course, the British had the mandate there. In other words, they were in control of it and they didn't want this influx. So they were blowing up boats which were going to take Holocaust survivors who were in harbours in Italy, were starving, terrified. All their families were dead, and they were trying to get there now. But people can have their own views on Palestine and what's happened ever since. But these were Holocaust survivors. There were some rumors that one of the boats, one of the bombs went off in the Mediterranean and sank. That doesn't seem to be true. That has been widely reported in books, but that certainly wasn't admitted on an official basis. I actually don't think it happened. But here you have MI6 admitting they were blowing up these boats in Italy, a friendly force, friendly government, bombing. That's a crime against Holocaust survivors. So I think if they're prepared, albeit after 70 years, to admit that, that maybe in another 50 years' time, they might begin to admit what had happened. And certainly if somebody like Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister of Britain, I tell you, there would have been massive declassification of files. The one thing the British do seem to do is keep these files. They don't seem to destroy them, shred them. And there's a very interesting book called Behind the Black Door, and it's about prime ministers of Britain and their relationships with the intelligence services. And in that book somewhere, they say that the really, really sensitive files are held by the Cabinet Office in a safe. Now, it's not a safe like you think, a small little thing. It's a floor. It's the floor of the Cabinet Office somewhere, and all the really, really, really dirty files are in there. So maybe one day, maybe one day.
Maybe one day. Tell me, your book detailed various actions, but it's a whole web of deceit. It's various, you could say, covert operations by state actors, non-state actors. Just to sum it up as we finish, what would you like readers to take from your book in relation to all these covert activities, these webs of deceit by these actors, state actors and non-state actors? How would you sum it up in terms of what would you like people to take from your book?
Leopards cannot change their spots. MI6 should be run by someone with a bit of sense. They should never have the people running it led by people who are brought up within MI6, because I think you become cocooned, you become paranoid, like the way Oldfield was, and Oldfield couldn't see the difference between the Citizens Defence Committees and the IRA and made horrible mistakes, which in fact boomeranged on Britain and helped set up the IRA. But leopards don't change their spots. I fear they're still up to their dirty tricks. Claire Daly, who's lost her bid to return to Dáil Éireann, she was very badly smeared as a Russian agent by the Ukrainian Secret Service. And this is not a conspiracy theory. They came out, they made an official statement saying she and others were Russian agents when they weren't. And who works hand in glove with that particular Ukrainian Secret Service? But your MI6, they're the best of friends. They work hand in glove. So there you have an Irish politician being smeared, not directly by MI6, but by the ally of MI6. You have the Cobalt affair, which is gathering a bit of momentum. That's the alleged Russian spy in the Oireachtas. I know who it's meant to be. I also firmly believe he wasn't, and I believe that there's a very sinister reason for that allegation being made against him. I think it's quite dressed up, and it all involves a particular initiative that the particular politician is involved in. The third thing I think British intelligence are still interested in Ireland is finding out about Brexit issues, European issues, and reporting back to Keir Starmer and his government about that. And they're also deeply, I think, involved in trying to convince the Irish public that really we should be pulling our weight and spending billions, not on hospitals or on sick people, but on buying tanks and rockets and bombs. And we should align ourselves closely with NATO. So they're still here. Leopards don't change their spots, Arthur.
Okay, just one final question just before we finish, because I was just thinking of this as you were speaking there. So some may come out and say, well, look, this man, David Burke, he's he's just angry, he's just bitter. This is why he's produced this book. There's no realism in what he's saying. He's just biased. He's anti-British, anti-MI6. What would you say to somebody who might come up with that argument?
Oh, read the book. In the books, I don't go off on rants. I say, here's the document, here's the quote, here's what the person said. I give you one example. Maybe we'll finish on this. People who say, well, Jack Lynch didn't, and I know I'm addressing a Cork audience. So people say Jack Lynch didn't know about the guns coming in before he was told by the police. Well, there's a declassified memo, and I quote it in my books, and it says, and this is a memo which was addressed to the Chief of Staff of the Irish Army on the 10th of February 1970, declassified. It's part of the National Archives. There's no doubt about its authenticity. And it says, the Taoiseach, that's Jack Lynch, and other ministers have met delegations from the North, that's the Citizens Defence Committees. At these meetings, urgent demands were made for respirators, weapons and ammunition, the provision of which the government has agreed. Accordingly, truckloads of these items will be put at readiness so that they may be available in a matter of hours. So I rarely make an argument unless I can back it up with some sort of quote or official document. So people who don't want to believe, well, you know the expression, what is it? I'll get this wrong, but the expression that goes, there's some people who, no matter what evidence you put under their nose, they're never going to believe you. And then there's other people who don't need any evidence put under their nose and they will believe you. And I think when it comes to British intelligence activities, nobody in Britain, for example, is going to believe any of this because they don't want to. There are a lot of people in Ireland will. I'm certainly not bitter in any way. I have loads of English friends. I have loads of cousins and relatives in England. I've been over there thousands of times. I support an English football club. I'm not anti-British. I don't think the British are bad people. What I do unfortunately think is that there are very, very, very bad people within what people nowadays call the deep state. And a lot of these people who came from colonies where there were horrible things being done in Kenya, for example, and they learned, like Kitson, they learned all of these horrific tactics of collusion, and they came to Northern Ireland and they deployed tactics that they had deployed in places like Kenya and Malaysia. They do not represent the British people. British people are wonderful. These people have to operate in secret and behind the backs of the British people, because if the British people knew what they were doing, they would be disgusted, because the British people are very fine people. It's unfortunate that these secret people in secret corners protected by all types of Official Secrets Act can do these things. But just because there's a tiny, tiny fraction of British people doesn't mean that the broader public are bad. And I certainly am not anti-British.
David Burke, barrister and author of the book, The Puppet Masters, How MI6 Masterminded Ireland's Deepest State Crisis. Thank you for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on.